It looks like old border cards weren't just for Time Spiral Remastered, with a brand new set of them coming out in Modern Horizons 2. And they can't put out such alluring new cards without me wanting to build yet another old border deck. So that's what we're going to do here today with the newest of the Elder Dragons, Piru the Volatile. Piru is a legendary Elder Dragon from the early days of Magic stories, and is most likely the start of a new cycle of Elder Dragons in the 3 colour wedges. She costs 2 red, 2 white, 2 black, and 2 generic to cast, and for that you get a 7/7 flying lifelink creature that you must pay red, black, and white for at the beginning of each turn, or sacrifice. This is based on the same template as the original Elder Dragons, who all have similar casting costs and an upkeep, but for Piru, that upkeep cost is not a downside, thanks to her last ability. When Piru dies, she deals 7 damage to each non-legendary creature, and since it's her dealing the damage, it's also affected by lifelink, turning into a supercharged version of Fumigate. This is a pretty amazing effect, so how can we build around her? Without the restrictions of old border cards, you could go diving into a lifegain deck using the black and white colours, or you could use her as a legendary matters deck, so her board wipe effect only affects your opponents. It would also work great as a group slug deck, where you play cards that constantly deal damage around the table. These are all great directions to take the deck, but we're going to be using the old border only restriction. I think the best way is to use a combination of these effects, built around a Reanimator and Aristocrat space. Once we get the mana to cast our commander, we can use the sudden influx of life to kill off our opponents, and use Reanimation to keep bringing Piru back over and over, without having to pay for a rather extreme mana cost. Like the Ogmont deck tech, this will be built to a $200 budget to allow the extra flexibility in a more restricted card pool of old border. It also requires many of the old border cards which have a slightly higher cost than their modern printings, which can inflate the price of a deck. Diving straight in, let's talk about our win conditions. First up is Repercussion, which allows us to turn our commander's ability into an effect that can kill players. For every non-legendary creature they have out, they'll end up taking 7 damage when Piru dies, and thanks to the lifelink, we won't take any. It's definitely a card to hold in hand until Piru is out and ready to be sacrificed, but it'll probably end the game once you play it. Next up is Sanguine Bond, a favourite finisher for any lifegain deck. Much like Repercussion, once Piru is out of the battlefield and can be sacrificed, playing this out will most likely take an opponent out of the game. Unfortunately, you have to choose a target opponent to lose life, so you can't take out the whole table at once. But given you'll just be bringing Piru back over and over, it will be something they'll be forced to deal with rather quickly. Next up is another favourite of lifegain and pillow fort decks, Test of Endurance. This card is very simple. If you have 50 or more life at the beginning of your upkeep, you win the game. This doesn't quite work how we want with Piru, as you must have 50 or more life at the start of your upkeep, so you can't just sacrifice Piru to get up to the 50 life you need. But with the sacrifice outlets we have in the deck, we should be able to achieve it on our opponent's end step, and have the life that we need to trigger this enchantment. Or we can simply sacrifice Piru in our turn, and hope nobody has enough left to knock us down below 50 life again. Lastly, we have one infinite graveyard combo to run, with Kiki-Jiki and Karmic Guide. As long as we have a sacrifice outlet on board, we can use Kiki-Jiki to make a copy of Karmic Guide, then sacrifice Kiki-Jiki before the trigger resolves, make a copy of Karmic Guide which brings back the Kiki-Jiki, which can then make another copy of Karmic Guide and repeat. This allows us to have an infinite number of hasty Karmic Guides to kill our opponents with. What makes this combo particularly strong is that we can also set up the whole thing with just 2 cards, Buried Alive and Victimize, by putting a sacrifice outlet, Karmic Guide and Kiki-Jiki into our graveyard with Buried Alive, and then bringing Karmic Guide and Kiki-Jiki out with the Victimize. It also helps give the deck some inevitability. Just filling up our graveyard over time will eventually get us all the pieces we need to win the game. Since we're relying on our graveyard for recurring our commander and getting value, let's talk about our reanimation spells. Apprentice Necromancer, Doom Necromancer, Alesha who smiles at death, Felon of the Third Path, Chainman Nightmare Adept, Karmic Guide, Phyrexian Delver, Victimize, and Angelic Renewal. And we've also got a Phyrexian Reclamation to help get creatures back into hand. I've tried to keep these mainly based around creatures, since reanimators like Alesha can be used to fetch better reanimators like Karmic Guide and Doom Necromancer. They also provide good life game fodder for Piru that the sorcery and aura based reanimators can't. In order to get cards into our graveyard, we have Buried Alive, the new Vile Entomber, and Dragon Mage to wheel out our hand. Ideally, we will just want to be playing out our creatures in this deck and recurring them once they've died, so I've kept this fairly small. These cards give us enough to tutor up the cards we need, but not going crazy by filling up our graveyard with lots of cards. Moving to our sacrifice outlets then, we have Carrion Feeder, Phyrexian Ghoul, Nantuko Husk, and High Market. I decided to go with creature-based sacrifice outlets since those are easier to get back with all our Reanimator spells, and High Market is just an obvious include since it comes on a land. The creatures are also much cheaper than the well-known altars for sacrifice, which help me fit in the win conditions for the deck instead. We then have a lot of random utility cards in this deck that don't really fit into a specific category, so we're going to go over them now. We have Gratuitous Violence to double the damage of all our creatures, which is great at making our commander's lifelink damage even stronger. We have Fervor and Anger to give everything haste, great for our high cost commander so she can attack immediately, and for the Reanimators with tap abilities. We also have Dragon Breath and Dragon Scales to help pump up Piru, giving haste, Fire Breathing and Vigilance when we get her out. To help with life gain, we have Soul Warden and Death Grasp, along with an Auramancer to get back our important enchantments if they get destroyed. Atali Primal Storm is a great reanimation target for us if we can tutor into the graveyard, and Bladewig the Risen can act as a reanimator specifically for our commander. Lastly, for our utility cards, we have Diabolic Tutor to help get win conditions into hand, since most of the tutors are well outside the price range for a deck like this. I feel like it's always good to run one, even if it is at 4 mana. So that covers the specifics for the deck. Let's talk about the ramp, draw and removal packages I've included. For ramp, we have Charcoal Diamond, Fire Diamond, Marble Diamond, Mind Stone, Star Compass, Bloodstone Cameo, Phyrexian Lens, Soul Grail, Heart, Skull and Tooth of Ramos, Solemn Simulacrum, and Terrain Generator. We have a very high cost commander, so we can't really skimp out on the ramp in this deck, otherwise we'd never get her out of the command zone. Since we aren't in green, we're mostly restricted to artifact ramp, and due to the complicated casting cost of Piru, we need to be mainly playing ramp that produces coloured mana. Solemn Simulacrum will act as a good recursion piece from our graveyard, and Terrain Generator should have plenty of hits with all the basics we're running in this deck. Moving on to draw, we have Read the Bones, Ancient Craving, Siphon Mind, Necrologia, Greed, Phyrexian Rager, Phyrexian Gargantua, and Harvester of Souls. This gives us a good spread of card draw, with all the creatures being reanimated over and over, and cards like Necrologia letting us turn our life gain into cards. The deck is a little light on card draw, but the ability to recur these creatures should help smooth out our draw somewhat. On to removal, we have a Swords to Plowshares, Disenchant, Rakdos Charm, Terminate, Bone Shredder, Shriekmaw, and Bone Shards for targeted removal, and then Rout, Wings of Wrath, Akroma's Vengeance, Decree of Pain, and Starstorm for board wipes. We need to survive until later turns in our game, so we have to pack lots of removal in order to handle whatever else is thrown at us. We can deal with almost any permanent type in these colours, so our removal is quite varied and should allow us to find answers when we need them. Our commander obviously also acts as a board wipe, so once we get to the later game we should have that on hand to use as well. Lastly, we should talk about the mana base, and despite being in 3 colours, it's going to have to be quite simple. Grand Colosseum, Shadowblood Ridge, Tainted Field, Tainted Peak, and Urborg Volcano are our lands that tap for multiple colours. Field of Ruin, Rocky Tar Pit, and Terminal Moraine can help us tutor for the colours we need, and then we have a Bajuka Bog, a High Market, and Terrain Generator for our utility lands. Along with this we have 10 swamps, 8 mountains, and 7 plains for our basic lands. The deck is a little heavier on black, so we want to make sure we get enough black sources out for our early game. The heavy colour requirements for our commander mean we can't really play many colourless lands in this deck, and the budget prevents us from running things like fetch lands or many of the other lands that produce any colour in Old Border. But if we're careful and keep safe hands and make sure we're drawing lots of cards, we should be able to get the colours we need from this mana base. So that's the deck. It's a bit slow to get going, but it has an inevitability built in. Piru can just win the game out of nowhere once she's out with our enchantments, and we can assemble an easy infinite combo in our graveyard if that is not managed by our opponents. The main trick is staying alive long enough to get our win conditions out and stopping our opponents from building an unstoppable board state in the meantime. With multiple win conditions and recursion, I definitely rate this deck a 7 on the power scale, with just its slow speed holding it back from being an 8. I feel like that keeps the deck more fair, however. It's more like a ticking time bomb at the table. Either your opponents are going to have to deal with it, or they're going to eventually lose. Piru is also an Elder Dragon with 7 power, so 3 hits from her will be able to knock a player out of the game, just like how the format was originally designed. And a 7/7 flying lifelink that will destroy most of the board if it's killed is a pretty big threat once she's out. It should be pretty easy to catch our opponents in a lose-lose situation. So that covers all the cards in this deck. Now we should talk about some of the things that didn't quite make the cut or are a bit too expensive. First up, I'd like to mention a bunch of the newly Old Border cards from Modern Horizons 1 and 2 that have been reprinted. I left most of these out of the deck because they're massively inflated in price right now, and it would be hard to include in the budget without knowing exactly where they're going to fall to. But most of these will be obvious includes after the set releases. Generous Gift, the Talismans, Hall of Heliod's Generosity, Prismatic Vista, Dolphy Voidwalker, and Dam would be automatic inclusions, as they give us the power of modern Magic cards but with our old border aesthetic. Outside of the new cards, we also have things like Soul Ring and Felwar Stone to improve our Rand package, and land tax to help find our different colours. Yawgmoth would be a great sacrifice outlet for the deck, giving us both card draw and a way to kill off our creatures, as would Astronaut's Altar, Phyrexian Altar, and Phyrexian Tower, giving us better payoffs for sacrificing creatures instead of just the ones we currently have. Otherwise, I think this deck is already fairly well rounded and is a great example of a threatening old border deck that can go toe to toe in most casual or mid-power commander games. You also get to play an Elder Dragon, which I always find enjoyable in a format that was named after them. So I hope you consider giving Piru a go, either as an old border deck like this or just as a normal commander deck, because it's a really interesting card where the drawback can actually be very useful. I've had a lot of fun designing and testing this deck, and I think you will too. But that's all for now, so thanks for watching and I'll see you next time.